Likutei Sichos, Chelik Chavav, volume 26, the second Sicha for Parshas Pikudei. This Sicha will explain the special connection between the Mishkan, that's the tabernacle, and Moshe Rabbeinu specifically, and also the difference between the construction of the Mishkan and the manufacturing of the priestly garments. It would be very worthwhile to go over the psukim, the verses pertaining to the beginning of the parsha. That's at least from the beginning of chapter 38 through verse 28, and especially verse 28, as an introduction to better familiarize ourselves with some of the concepts that will be mentioned in this Sicha. So we know that the construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, and everything that went along with it, actually was in several phases. First, as described in last week's parsha, this week's parsha, first they constructed the actual Mishkan, the actual tabernacle. Then they manufactured the vessels, such as the menorah, the altar, and so on. And after that come the priestly garments. Another thing to be familiar with is, right in the beginning of the parsha, refers to the Mishkan as Mishkan Ha'edus, the Mishkan of testimony. What is the testimony? So number one, that Hashem had forgiven them for the terrible sin of the golden calf. Number two, and this is part of it, as proof that Hashem is dwelling amongst them. So this is testimony, the fact that there is a Mishkan. Another concept to be familiar with, there's an idea where when a craftsman, a professional, takes and makes a vessel or a product, in other words, takes raw material, receives raw material, and on behalf of the client, constructs something, makes something out of it. Well, the fact that the craftsmen put in their expertise and they now transformed the raw material, which was nothing, which was just raw, into something viable, something worthwhile, that in itself makes it as if, to an extent, so to speak, that the Uman, the craftsman, has some ownership, has now acquired some ownership in it, because they're the one who manipulated the raw material and turned it into something. In other words, their mark is very visible, is very obvious, it's very evident. And therefore they have an ownership, and that's really essentially what they're getting paid for. Another thing to be familiar with, according to the Torah, when one witnesses another transgressing, committing an avera, committing a sin, one has an obligation to be moicha. One has an obligation to protest, of course, in the right manner, in an effective manner, but you have an obligation. You can't just stand by and ignore it. In fact, the rule is that one who has the ability to protest and perhaps maybe a chance at preventing the other person from doing a sin and doesn't bother to do so, they become attached to the actual sin, even though they didn't do anything. They just stood by, they just watched, or they just turned away. In fact, they become like an accomplice, as if they themselves committed the sins. Another thing to be familiar with is that everything that Moshe Rabbeinu made, everything that Moshe Rabbeinu did is forever, is nitzchi. Ma'aseh yedei Moshe nitzchim. For example, you don't need a better example than this, the Torah. Moshe delivered the Torah to us, and the Torah will never change. The Torah will never go away. Another thing that serves as an example, which pertains to our Sicha, the Mishkan and all its kelim, the tabernacle and all its vessels, are actually still in existence as we speak now. In fact, when Mashiach comes, as the Rambam tells us, they're going to be revealed from their hiding place in the catacombs under the Temple Mount, in that plaza. They are there, and they are waiting for us to see them. So the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu oversaw their construction, it means it was made under his leadership, means that they are everlasting. One more thing, in the Torah, whenever there are what seem to be opposing translations or explanations to the same word or the same concept, even though on the surface they may seem to be opposing and maybe even perhaps contradictory, they maybe seem to be so different that they almost contradict each other, but yet when one looks into the matter more deep, on a deeper level, and really analyzes it, one comes to understanding how they actually could not only reconcile the two, bring the two together, but they actually complement each other. Let's go into the Sicha. So the Kli Yakar, who's one of the prominent commentaries on the Torah, explains that the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu gave an accounting only on the silver and the copper, if you read those verses, you would see that only on the silver and the copper he gave an accounting what was done with the silver, what was done with the copper, versus the gold that is only mentioned the amount of gold that was contributed, the amount that was received by the collectors of the donation. But it doesn't actually describe what was done with the gold. He explains why this happened. And according to the Kli Yakar, he says because as soon as they finished constructing the Mishkan, everything that they used the silver and copper for, he wanted to give immediately an accounting for it. Whereas the gold, says the Kli Yakar, since, yes, of course, there was much gold that went into the construction of the Mishkan and its vessels, but they still were not finished using the gold, because some of the gold was used after the accounting was used in the manufacturing of the priestly garments, especially the garments of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And therefore, he didn't end up giving an accounting for the gold. That means in the first stage of the parsha, to summarize, there's an accounting to the exact detail as to what was done with what was used, what the silver and copper was used for, whereas the gold, there's no accounting. The question is why? Okay, I understand why at this phase he's giving an accounting for the silver and the copper and not yet for the gold. But at the end of the day, he doesn't account for the gold. Well, the Kli Yakar quotes a medrash that says that when Moshe was giving the accounting on the silver gold, he had actually forgotten what happened with 1,775 shekel worth of silver. It just flew out of his mind. And he didn't know what to do. And immediately a heavenly voice came out and says, and that's the verse that says that with 1,775 shekel, that's what he made the hooks for. That verse is not Moshe's words, you'll see the verse, but rather that is the heavenly voice that came out. And therefore, says the Kli Yakar, once everybody heard this heavenly voice, it became clear and obvious that everything is accounted for. Hashem trusts Moshe, so therefore they trust Moshe. They see that from above. They certified the fact that Moshe used everything with full integrity, so therefore there was no longer any need for an accounting specifically on the gold. Says the Rebbe, this is a great explanation, but there's still some problems with it. Number one, we do look closely to the verses, and you'll see that after this verse, that the heavenly voice that came out and said the accounting for all the silver, Moshe still gives an accounting in detail for the copper. So this seems that there is a need to give some accounting, right? Because he gives accounting for the copper post this heavenly voice. That's number one. Number two, in any case, if there's already a heavenly voice coming out to establish the integrity of Moshe, that everything was used with full integrity, and there was no whatsoever misuse of the contributions, then why didn't just do it in the beginning to save him the whole entire accounting for the silver and for the copper and for the other stuff? Says the Rebbe, the answer for this will be understood by first analyzing the entire matter. Why was there, at the first place, any need for Pekudas HaMishkan, for the accounting of the Mishkan? Number one. Number two, after the Parsha opens up and says, Eile Pikudei HaMishkan, this is the accounting of the Mishkan, it doesn't go over immediately to give us the actual accounting, but rather, in the next two verses, what does it say? Oh, Betzalel and Aholiav were the ones who constructed the Mishkan. They did everything that Hashem had commanded Moshe. The question is, why do we need to hear this again? We know this. This is an established fact. From last Parsha, from before, this has been already mentioned many times. Anybody that read Parshas Vayakel and Truma Tetzavel and does not know by now that Aholiav and Betzalel and Aholiav constructed a Mishkan, they didn't read it properly. So why would you have to say it again? And why squeeze it? Why is it also squeezing it in right here between telling us that there's an account for the Mishkan and the actual account? Why did he squeeze it in here? This actually, so to speak, forces us, this pushes us in the direction to say that this whole entire matter of this account is not just to give us an accounting, is not just to establish that everything was used with full integrity, but rather that this is a very, very general and fundamental idea in the whole construction of the Mishkan. And Rebbe says, here is the explanation. The Mishkan, the entire tabernacle, had to belong to all the Jews collectively, to Klal Yisrael as a communal property. It could not have belonged in any way to an individual or individuals, even though individuals were the one who contributed. As the Torah says, each individual, by their own decision and by their own estimation, in other words, their own desire, their individuality, so to speak, was expressed in it, as they contributed what they wanted to contribute. But at the end, in order for it to be a Mishkan, it had to become all fused together as communal property. No longer belong to the individual, but rather become everyone's property. Why? Because this was serving as an atonement for everyone collectively, for the terrible sin of the Chet HaEgel, which they all did together collectively. And this was a sign, as we said in the introduction, to show that Hashem is dwelling amongst them all collectively. And therefore, all the contributions had to be brought to Moshe. Moshe is the leader, and through it being brought to Moshe, by him collecting it all and putting it all together in one pool, it all became now communal property. It all became collectively of all of the collective. It all became, property of the entire collective. But after Betzalel and Aholiav contributing their expertise, their touch, their craftsmanship to all this material, meaning they took the raw material and they constructed a Mishkan, there's perhaps some possibility, albeit remote, that in a certain sense they have also an ownership and they are only individuals because they are the craftsmen. And therefore the Torah emphasizes, the Torah says, that the Pikudei HaMishkan, the accounting of the Mishkan, which was done according to Moshe, Al Pi Moshe, and therefore it underscores that even though Eliyav, even though Betzalel and Eliyav were the ones to actually construct it, but this was still under the leadership of Moshe, meaning it never ceased being a collective communal property. And therefore, right after the words Pikudei HaMishkan, it pauses and it tells us Betzalel and Eliyav indeed did do the actual construction, right? And this is telling us why we need to have an accounting, that it should not in any way ever be as if it belongs to the individuals. In short, just to summarize, the whole purpose objective of the whole purpose and objective of Parshas Pikudei is to establish, is to confirm that the Mishkan is a communal property of all of Israel, and these two verses reminding us about Betzalel and Eliyav being the ones who actually constructed it is to tell us why it's necessary, why it was so important to establish the fact that it should never ever leave and never ever cease from being communal property. Now, this is as far as the Mishkan itself is concerned. However, as far as the priestly garments, although they do have to be, the priestly garments, they were made after the Mishkan. After the Mishkan was made, after the Mishkan was constructed, that's when they made the priestly garments. As Rashi clearly spells out in Parshas Tetzaveh, if you look in chapter 28, verses 1 and 3. In fact, the entire sanctity and effect of the kahuna, of the priesthood, is only after there is a Mishkan. After there is a place where Hashem says, "V'shachanti b'soicham," I will dwell amongst them, I'll dwell in it, then there is an effectiveness to the kahuna. That means the kahuna comes to serve, the priesthood comes to serve the Mishkan. It's not an actual, so to speak, established thing in itself. Rather, it's attached to the Mishkan. So first you build the Mishkan, first you have the Mishkan established, and as we say, the Mishkan became established, that it is communal property, that it belongs to the tzibur, that it belongs to Klal Yisrael, and therefore Hashem will dwell in it for the entire Klal Yisrael. How did this happen? By being given to Moshe and Moshe overseeing it. Once we're done with that, then they went to manufacture the priestly garments. And now we can appreciate why there was no count on the gold. Because the Mishkan, because of it being, like we said, the Mishkan Ha'edus, a Mishkan of testimony, therefore, as we said, it had to belong to each and every person. Whereas the priestly garments, true that they have to be from communal funds, but it's not the same emphasis that's put on it. It's not the same hadgasha, not the same firmness that we put on the Mishkan, that it has to be so absolutely belonging to all of the Klal Yisrael equally. And based on what we just explained, we'll appreciate another very interesting insight in this entire matter. What was really accomplished by converting all the individual contributions and making it into communal money? Why did it have to be dafka by Moshe, through Moshe Rabbeinu? In other words, why wasn't it sufficient that the money should be brought to the appointees, to Betzalel and Eliyav, and they serve, representing the community, will now, by pulling it all together, will now turn it in to communal money, to communal funds, and belonging to everyone? Why was it necessary that it should be brought specifically to Moshe? Asher pukat al pi Moshe. Why Moshe? The answer is, Moshe was the only Jew, the only individual that had absolutely no requirement, no necessity of an atonement for the Chet HaEgel. Because not only he wasn't actively part of it, but he wasn't even here, so to speak, down here in the earth, together with them, to even be in the category of one who should have protested but didn't protest. In other words, he couldn't even be in any way even remotely attached to the sin itself. And therefore, every other Jew, regardless of the fact if they were actively involved in the Chet HaEgel or not, directly involved or not, but they were all guilty by association, each and every single one of them needed to have their own personal atonement. And therefore, if it would come to them, meaning if they would be brought to Betzalel or to Eliyav, they couldn't affect this power of community, this power of Klal, as good as Moshe. Because each one of them had an individual connection to the matter. They had an individual interest, so to speak. The necessity they had for their own individual atonement, besides being part of the collective, would, so to speak, obstruct them from being able to effectively make all these contributions so communal, so klali. Whereas Moshe, where his whole connection to this whole thing is only because he's their leader, and he had absolutely no shaykhs to the actual sin, the actual Chet HaEgel, therefore he was the one who was able to blend everything together, so to speak, and make it communal property. And therefore in our parsha, it describes how after the Mishkan was complete, they brought it to Moshe, and he is the one who put up the Mishkan. He is, everything in the Mishkan had to happen through him to make sure that not only in the contribution phase, but also after the manufacturing phase, as we said, it should never ever be as if it belongs to some individual, even on some level, and it should come back to be communal. Says the Rebbe, this is another difference between the construction of the Mishkan and the manufacturing of the priestly garments. You see, the Mishkan had another great aspect to it. And even over the two Beis HaMikdash, the two Bate Mikdashes, How is that? Since the Mishkan was made through Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who manufactured it, and we know that Ma'aseh Yedei Moshe Nitzchim, everything that went through Moshe's hands, everything that was done under his leadership is forever, is eternal. Therefore, the Mishkan also had a nitzchias in it. It's eternal. As we said in the introduction, it still exists today. And therefore, every single detail had to happen by Moshe's direction, Pekudas Moshe. Whereas the Bigdei Kahuna, the priestly garments, there's no eternal aspect to them. It's just that they have to serve the Mishkan. And therefore, it didn't have to be made necessarily, and certainly didn't have to go through Pekudas Moshe, the accounting of Moshe, the direct involvement of Moshe, as the Mishkan did. Now, this idea that through the accounting of the Mishkan by Moshe, it became a connection between the Mishkan and all its vessels to Moshe is also compatible with the esoteric explanation of the word Pikudei according to the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe explains, and based on the halacha that Gemara says that before a man sets out to a long journey, chayav adam lifkoid. Notice the word lifkoid, Pikudei, lifkoid es ishtay. That a person is obligated to have pikida, which is intimacy with his wife, before he sets out for a long journey. Thus, what does it mean? Pikudei hamishkan, the accounting, the pikudim of the Mishkan through Moshe, that this became, so to speak, the same thing that is accomplished through intimacy, this became one thing with Moshe. The question is, however, if we really look at these two pirushim, these two interpretations of the word pikudei, they seem to be opposing and if not even contradictory. How so? Well, the accounting, what does it mean when you pikudei in terms of count? A count is something that limits, not only something limited, but something most superficial. It doesn't even describe the inner value of the thing. It just gives it a number. How many units you have. In other words, it's very, very superficial and very, very limiting. Finite. Now, Pikudei, in terms of how the Alter Rebbe explains it, Kabbalistically, that it means intimacy. What happens as a result of first of all, it's the most pneumistic thing. It's the most inner connection that it could be. And it creates something which is infinite. The fact is, even literally, when there is intimacy, and later there's a reproduction which expresses the ultimate koyach ha'ein soif, the ultimate power of the infinite power of Hashem. How do you reconcile the two? These are two opposites. Says the Rebbe, no. Dafka, specifically by these two things that seem to be opposing, but they come together, they actually represent the true nature and the true purpose of the Mishkan. How so? The ultimate objective of the Mishkan is to fuse together the finite and the infinite. In the one hand, the Mishkan had to be a very finite dimensions. It had to be specifically this, made out of this material, made out of these dimensions, and so on. Very specific. On the other hand, what was the purpose of the Mishkan? For the Shekhinah, for Hashem's presence, the ultimate level of infinity to be dwelling in this space. And we actually can see an expression of this, an actual real life example of this in the Aron, in the ark that stood in the Mishkan. We know that the Gemara says, Makom ha'aron eino min hamida, that the actual space that the Aron, that the ark took up, didn't take up any space. So in the one hand, the Aron, the ark, was very finite. It had dimensions, as the Torah describes also in this parsha. And if it didn't have those dimensions, it wouldn't be a kosher ark. It wouldn't fit the purpose. But at the same time, while it was standing there in the Kodesh HaKadosh, the Holy of Holies, if they would measure from one wall to the ark and from the other side of the ark to the other wall, it seemed as if it didn't take up any space at all. And this is what's hinted in the two Perushim, in the two interpretations of this word as they come together. In the one hand, minyan, account, which is gvul, which is finite, and the yichud, the intimacy, the fusion together, which is the bligvul. And they become one, not in a way where the gvul, where the finite aspect of things become dissolved. In other words, you can say that the infinite overpowers the finite, and now the finite is no longer. That's not what happened here. That's not the ultimate fusion. The ultimate fusion is that the finite remains finite. Like we said with the ark. You can measure it. You see it. It's there. It exists. It's not gone. And at the same time, it assumes an existence of infinity. In other words, it's finite, and at the same time, the role that it plays is an infinite role. It doesn't take up any space. And this is the emphasis over here. By giving an exact accounting in the Mishkan, and at the same time, it becomes the ultimate, so to speak, unity, intimacy with the ultimate, which is Hashem himself, and that's what's accomplished over here in this part.